Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our very first webinar for the Southern California APWA chapter. We'll be starting shortly around 12:05 on the dot to allow for all the other users to log in. While we wait, what we're going to end up doing is showing the annual sponsors for APWA and looping through that. If you all would feel free to Google them for future public work needs, and I'll be back with you shortly. Hi, everyone. Just letting you guys know that we'll start at 12:05. So bear with us. Please take this opportunity to look at our annual sponsors. Thank you. All right, it's 12:05. So welcome everyone. I am Tran. I'm the chapter president of Southern California APWA chapter. I want to welcome all of you from our valued members to our prospective members, from the board of directors and myself. We thank you all for participating in this webinar and making this a success for our chapter. We're exceeding our expectations for attendees. I'm sure we're going to keep on rolling through with attendees throughout this presentation. So thank you guys for joining us today. We certainly have a lot to go over, as well as hopefully it'll be something that's very educational on your side. With that, as typical with a lot of our luncheons and meetings, we always start with the Pledge of Allegiance. And if you guys could, I'll go ahead and put on the flag right here. If you guys could stand, if you're able, please do so. And ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, guys. And as typical, I would also like to take this opportunity to also thank every one of our sponsors for 2020, our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors, as you saw in the loop that we had in the beginning. So we appreciate all our valued sponsors and thank you for investing in us. While we are not physically together, we also typically would like to acknowledge our past presidents who have registered for this event. We thank you for all the years and support and service to APWA. So thank you very much for being with us today. So a little bit of housekeeping. Typically with webinars, everyone is muted on the attendee side. So the only way that we could communicate back and forth with one another is if you use the questions box or tab. I will be monitoring that as well as the chat box. So hopefully we will be able to communicate in that manner. We're going to save all the questions that you have for our wonderful speakers at the very end. And so if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in there. I will be screening them so that you guys won't have to ask all those questions all at once at the very end. So if you have something, just go ahead and type that in. I'll be going and looking through that. With that, we'll just go ahead and start with introductions. So this webinar is being moderated by one of our own, Mr. Ahmad. Ahmad is the president of SA Associates. SA Associates is a consulting engineering firm specializing in water and wastewater engineering with offices in Arcadia and Anaheim. He has over 40 years of experience focusing on city, county, and municipal agencies. Sean has a long history of service with APWA. He currently serves as our Region 8 Director. So with that, with being a Region 8 Director, that includes California, Hawaii, and Nevada. He has served as APWA President in the past as well, so thank you for being a past President and your continued leadership and support of our chapter. Thank you, Sean. Fun fact of Sean, Sean lives with a house full of women, with his wife, 4 daughters, and a female dad. So he is the epitome of that hashtag girl dad. There. And on the side, he might have a reality show called Keeping Up with Mods, right? All kidding aside, Sean is a wonderful person to have part of this and being moderating for our exceptional panel. So with that, Sean, please take it away and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, great, Tran. Thanks very much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you're all here joining us for this first webinar. Hopefully it goes well. If you have any comments, suggestions, criticisms, please send them to us so we can improve it for the next time. This could be the new normal, you never know. Today, the format we're going to have is we have 2 very exceptional panelists. I'll introduce them just in a little bit. But we have a series of preset questions, 7 questions that we pre-selected. I'll ask those questions of each panelist, and they have slides prepared to respond to those questions. So hopefully that format is a little bit different than what you're probably used to and what I'm used to, frankly, but hopefully it'll go well and we'll see how that goes. So the first panelist is Rosanne Weston, and Rosanne is the engineering manager of the Yorba Linda County Water District. She has a BS in civil engineering from Cal State Long Beach and a Master of Science in Engineering, Civil Engineering from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She has over 30 years of experience in the management and design of municipal water and wastewater facilities and has managed capital improvement programs up to $1 billion, that's with a B. And prior to joining Yorba Linda, she owned a municipal engineering firm with offices in Miami, Atlanta, and Nashville. And a fun fact about Rosanne, she is a previous recipient of an APWA scholarship. So that's good to hear that she's stuck with the field. She has 4 children and a Labradoodle named Kobe, probably after Kobe Bryant. Our next panelist is Adan Ortega. He represents the City of Fullerton on Metropolitan Water District's 38-member board, a rather large board. He serves on several committees on MET, including the Finance and Insurance Committee, Engineering and Operations Committee, the Organization, Personnel and Technology Committee, and the Integrated Regional Plan Committee. Looks like a full-time job for him. He has worked in public policy and government relations for 30 years, most recently at Ortega Strategies Group, which he founded in 2009. He is most recently noted for helping to lead efforts to bring technical assistance to small community water systems in disadvantaged communities around California. Adan served as MET's Vice President of External Affairs from 1999 to 2005. And prior to that, he served as Secretary of State Bill Jones's Chief Deputy and also as Assistant General Manager of the West Basin and Southern Basin Municipal Water Districts. He was appointed in 2013 by Governor Jerry Brown to the California Water Commission and by Governor Schwarzenegger to the California State Board of Food and Agriculture, where he chaired his water committee from 2005 to 2012. And then a fun fact about Don, he's a dedicated ultra marathon runner, not just marathon, but ultra marathon, which is, a little bit higher than 26.2 miles. And he's also an open water swimmer. Adan is married to Susan, and they have a son, Alan, who lives in New York City. So those are the panelists, and I will get started with the questions. The first question, Adan, goes to you, and that question is, can you describe the way regulatory process has changed over the last several years? Adan?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Sean and Tran, for hosting this webinar. To discuss the changes in the drinking water regulatory process, I should set the stage by saying that prior to 2014, the Division of Drinking Water, which sets safe drinking water standards, was under the State Department of Health and Human Services. In 2014, the division was transferred to the State Water Resources Control Board. Some of the major drivers that have changed from the time that this was at Department of Health to now is that economic feasibility of the regulations is driving the dynamics. There's also a lack of a system that triggers regulations. So I can't sit here and tell you this is what gets a regulation started. But this has also fostered a lot of frustration, not just by the nonprofits and activist groups that want safe drinking water for everybody, but also for the water supply community and for legislators, and not to mention the regulators themselves, who often find themselves in the middle of a standard setting process without the budget to do what they need to do. Also, I think it's important to understand that the power to create a regulation or begin the promulgation of a regulation sits on the head of one person, and he is the head of the Division of Drinking Water, who also serves as one of the deputy administrators for the safe drinking water for the State Water Resources Control Board. But he doesn't have any guidelines that basically say to him, this is when you have to begin the process for setting a safe drinking water standard. So there's frustration, and it often leads to legislation that drives priorities on new standards. And you're going to hear a lot about that today in our discussion. We're going to talk about two contaminants in particular. One of them is Chromium-6, and there was a maximum contaminant level that was legislatively mandated in 2001. It is naturally occurring for the most part. But the MCL that was adopted in 2014, as you'll hear, was in 2012, was later invalidated in 2017. And then we're going to talk about PFAS and the response levels and public notifications that were legislatively mandated for that. PFAS is a series of chemicals. They're called forever chemicals. That have spread out because of the use of things like Scotchgard and Teflon, things that suppress fires, that waterproof, heat-proof, that we find in cookware and recreational clothing. So this stuff is everywhere, and there's a response level, and we'll talk a little bit about what that involves. And go to the next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself. So that's the end of that question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adan. So next question that I have for Adan again is you. It seems like regulations are coming before the science. And what can you tell us about that?
Well, that's a matter of debate. MCL development, or maximum contaminant levels, are based on toxicology studies. Basically, what happens when an MCL is set is that there's an office called the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, OEHA. It's based in Oakland, and they conduct a public health code that's based on toxicological studies that are either based on humans when possible, most often rats, and they basically try to figure out what the risk threshold is based upon things like cancer or other kinds of physical or health reactions that could be experienced in a living organism. So then what happens is that those go to the State Water Resources Control Board that must set a maximum contaminant level as close to the public health goal as possible. And that's based on economic feasibility, or it's supposed to be based on economic feasibility, as well as the available technology to be able to mitigate the risks that are cited by OEHA. Response levels and notification levels are very different. I'm going to talk mostly about response levels. And response levels are based, again, on the statistical calculation of risk of 1 in a million cancers. And they're set in the abundance of caution. So you can do this on anything. You can do this on sugar. You can do this on salt. You can say, at what level is this thing not going to present a risk for any factor to human health? And that's what response levels are. So they're statistical calculations. Some would argue that statistical calculations are science. Others would say, no, you need toxicology to have science, but that's the debate. In terms of public notifications, we're now treating MCLs and response levels alike. And again, remember, one is based on toxicology and the other one's based on statistics. So what has happened on the two contaminants that we're talking about here with Chromium-6 is, as I mentioned, the standard for Chromium-6 of 10 parts per billion was invalidated in California because the State Water Board, the courts found, had not, or the Department of Health, prior to the transfer of the Division of Drinking Water to the State Water Boards, had not done an economic feasibility assessment. Now, there are others that have used toxicology and more recent studies to adopt a total standard for chromium. And for those of you that know a little science, there's different kinds of chromium. There's trivalent chromium, for example, that we use as a supplement. It helps with our digestion and our brain function. And then there's hexavalent chromium, which could be cancerous, primarily through inhalation. So what the Canadians decided is to have a standard for total chromium of 100 parts per billion. In California, we have a standard for total chromium of 50 parts per billion, which is more stringent. Now, PFAS, there's 4,000 varieties of PFAS, and the detection range and the protocols have not been determined, for very many of these. So we're concentrating only on 2 for which there's a response level that water agencies, as you'll hear next, have to notify the public if they find them beyond the statistical calculation of 1 in a million chance of risk. And so we still have to set a toxicology study to determine the risk thresholds. The Division of Drinking Water has reported that they've approached OEHA, but OEHA is very busy. And of course, they need money to do the toxicology studies, and all of that is pending. So that's where we are on this question.
Okay, thanks, Adan. So next question goes to Rosanne. And Rosanne, Adan just spoke briefly about the changes in drinking water regs. And I want to ask you, how have these changes impacted water districts in Southern California, and specifically your district, the Yorba Linda Water District?
Well, I think before answering that question, I'm going to, Adan, could you go over the limits, the regulatory limits of
Yes, I will.
PFAS? Okay.
And sorry, I neglected that. So what's PFAS? So PFAS has 2 main forms, and they're difficult to pronounce. But I always try. It's perfluorooctanoic, which is PFOA acid, and then there's another one that ends with sulfonic, which is a different form, and that's frequently referred to as PFOS or PFAS, and then PFOA. So there's 2 of them that we're concerned about. In 2009, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency set a provisional health advisory for both of these substances. And you can see that for PFOA, it was 400 parts per trillion, and for PFAS, it's 200 parts per trillion. And we'll discuss later how these rank in risk so that you have a perception of what they mean in the natural environment. In 2016, the US EPA basically combined the 2 for a 70 part per trillion standard for a lifetime health advisory. They basically tell the water suppliers, if you reach this level, there's a level of risk that we hope that you'll account for. There's no formal regulation that requires you to do anything at this level. In 2018, oh darn it, somebody keeps calling me. In 2018, the Division of Drinking Water issued an interim notification and response levels in California, and the notification levels are levels at which a water supplier has to notify the elected officials that they've reached this level. So it's 14 parts per trillion for PFOA and 13 parts per trillion for PFAS. And then there was a response level, and what response levels require, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but what they require for most response levels is that you notify the public through the annual consumer confidence reports. We all get this at home once a year from our water supplier. In 2019, the Division of Drinking Water issued reduced notification levels, and then they lowered it for PFOA to 5.1 parts per trillion. And then the notification level for PFAS went to 6 parts per trillion. So we're getting into the real molecular level here. And in 2020, the Division of Drinking Water in February, they reduced the response levels for PFOA to 10 parts per trillion, and for PFAS, 40 parts per trillion. And as you'll hear, this has had very significant ramifications for water suppliers, including, for example, the city of Fullerton that I represent, that has had to shut down half its about 5 wells in our water supply system. So thank you.
Okay, very good. It's amazing how times have changed. When I started out in this business, many years ago, we had parts per million, then it went to parts per billion. Now it's parts per trillion. I'm not sure what comes next after trillion, maybe parts per gazillion. But getting back to Rosanne's question, Rosanne, do you want me to repeat the question? I'll repeat the question for you, Rosanne.
Yes, please. And next slide.
Okay. Adan spoke briefly just now about the changes in drinking water regs and how have these changes impacted water districts in California, and specifically your district, the Yorba Linda Water District.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'm really happy. Good afternoon to everybody who's on the call right now on the webinar. And just to follow on what Adan said is, so following up with these regulatory limits, the DDW, which is Division of Drinking Water, actually issued monitoring orders across the state to various water agencies and said, you have to test your water for PFAS. Now, they looked at previous sampling that had been done and just how close the agencies were to certain places of potential PFAS sources, and said, okay, you have to monitor. This required 4 quarters of sampling, and the state got the results back, and then they're going to be issuing another monitoring order in July of 2020 to kind of spread out a little bit and see how vast is this problem. But as you can see, about half of the wells that were required to be tested are in LA, in Orange County, and Riverside, about 300 wells. So the impact in Southern California has been extremely significant. Next slide, please. So let me just step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about Orange County. So the Orange County Basin is managed by the Orange County Water District, OCWD. And in that water district, or in that basin, there are 19 member agencies. We call them water producers. And of those 19 member agencies that were required to test, 11 of us have impacted wells. That is, our wells registered above the response levels. These are the lowered the response levels. And so of those 51 wells above the response levels, many of these were already taken out of service, like Adan was saying. And with the new monitoring order that's coming in July, we expect that maybe 71 of these wells will be deemed as being over the response level. So that's a significant amount of water. That's about 100,000 acre feet per year of water that's impacted, about a third of the water basin. And so how has this affected us economically? Well, it's going to be about a $1 billion impact, at least over 30 years. So what is that made of? That's made of the fact that if you shut your wells down, you have to buy import water, which is twice as expensive as the groundwater. It also requires the design and construction of treatment plants and O&M costs over 30 years for the life of the facility. And these are forever chemicals. So once we get some sort of treatment up and running, I mean, basically we're going to be pumping it and treating the basin to try to get this PFAS out of there. But we also have to stop the source of the contamination. So next slide, please. So what is the source of PFAS? And well, these are the companies, and there are a few more spinoffs. And a lot of the PFOA and the PFAS, well, they stopped producing it in, I think it was 2000. But the problem is we're still getting them in import goods. And these are forever chemicals, so they stay around, they get in the groundwater. And so one of the things that the majority of the water producers in Orange County who are impacted, they have decided to participate with OCWD in potential litigation against these companies. Next slide, please. So as Adan mentioned, these are PFOA, PFAS, and all the other PFAS chemical compounds, which are not even regulated yet, are in these everyday products that we use. Next slide, please. So this is very interesting information. So there was some sampling done by OCWD within the basin itself, surface water, some monitoring wells, some of our wells, and also some of the wastewater treatment plant dischargers who discharged to the Santa Ana River. They monitored, and this is voluntarily, they monitored their discharges. And what they found, these wastewater treatment plant dischargers found, is PFAS is in the wastewater that they're discharging in the Santa Ana River. And the Santa Ana River is what recharges part of the water that recharges our groundwater basin. So this is something that most likely wastewater treatment plants are going to have to treat for PFAS before they discharge to the Santa Ana River. And as a matter of fact, the wastewater treatment plants are probably going to get a monitoring order from DDW as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to tell you about our district and how it has impacted us. So as you can see, we cover quite a large area. Yorba Linda, parts of Placentia, parts of Brea, unincorporated Orange, Anaheim. And we generally, well, before we heard about PFAS, we were pumping about 77% groundwater, and the rest was import water. So we had the ability to serve both import water or groundwater to our entire district. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful to have the redundancy in water sources. But then enter PFAS, and then the lowered response levels. And so we had to shut all of our 11 wells down. So we are on import water right now, and that costs us about $8 million more a year, and that's unbudgeted. That's something where we're probably going to have to raise the rate in order to pay for this. And then we're going to have to do something about the problem. Next slide, please. So this is our headquarters, and a lot of our wells are located at our headquarters. And you can see some of the levels for PFOA and PFAS there. Now we have a unique system in that all of our 11 wells actually the flow is conveyed up to a reservoir, and then we would blend there. So before the lowered response levels, we were able to blend down so we'd be below the response levels. But now that these response levels are very low, we see no choice but to shut off our wells and come up with some sort of treatment system. Next slide, please. And here are the wells just south of us. And I just want to point out to you, these are the recharge basins for the OC Basin. And in the lower right corner, you can see this is the Santa Ana River. So the PFAS comes down the Santa Ana River, and we don't have a major point source. We think this is where it's coming from. And that flow is diverted into these recharge basins. And that's how it gets into our groundwater. Next slide, please. So we said, what are we going to do about this? We can't do nothing. We can't continue to pay import water costs. That's roughly on average $22,000 a day extra above what we pay for groundwater. And that includes pumping and everything. So we decided to conduct a pilot study. And we were very fortunate. We negotiated with some vendors and media suppliers, and they did a pilot study, and they tested our water using resin and GAC. And this is all done for free, no cost to us. And so we found out a lot about our water because you have to test your own water and see the particular water quality, and that will impact your treatment facilities and the type of media that you choose. This is about a 4.5 month study. Next slide, please. So I have to say that we've been following PFAS for quite a while. We've been looking at technology. We have a board member who actually went on a lot of the tours with us. He's a PFAS expert. We're very fortunate. That would be Dr. Miller. And we looked at GAC, we looked at reverse osmosis, we looked at ion exchange. And there are pros and cons of each. First of all, the reverse osmosis at this time just doesn't pencil for us. It's too expensive. Ion exchange and GAC, when you look at capital, if you look at life cycle costs, you include the O&M costs and everything, they're about the same. But the thing that really helped us is that we have a very small footprint at each of our sites. And with ion exchange, you actually need same size vessels, but fewer vessels. And so that played into the consideration. Also, we know that there are new regulations that are coming down for the other PFAS family compounds, and ion exchange seems to do better with the short chains. So we're preparing for the future when we have to remove some of those. And also, we have such a fluctuation in flows. We have a low of 7 million gallons per day, and then we can pump groundwater up to about 22 million gallons per day. And so during the low season, basically, we'll have to shut some of these vessels off. And the ion exchange does better in this particular instance than even the RO or the activated carbon, and there's less fouling. And in our pilot study, we saw that even though we had everything sitting after we conducted the test for about almost 3 months, in reality, there was no fouling at all of the material, just sitting in a hot shed. So that was very enlightening. Next slide, please. So here's our headquarters, and we are going to be designing, constructing a treatment plant. And when I say we, it's really OCWD. We considered designing and constructing our own treatment plant, but with COVID and everything else, we said, you know what, OCWD said they take it on. They would pay for it directly, and they would also pay up to 50% of our O&M costs. Now, we're not special. They're doing this for the other producers who want to build treatment plants, and we're very fortunate in that way. Eventually, the 19 member agencies will have to share in the cost we'll be charged additional assessments over time. But this really helps us out in getting started and getting up and running with the treatment facility. So we're going to have treatment at our headquarters. Next slide. We're going to have treatment at well 20. And the next slide, please. And treatment at well 21. So the reason why we set it up so we have treatment at headquarters and treatment at the wells is we want some redundancy. And so if something happens at the headquarters, we can still be up and running with groundwater. And what we're seeing is we're going to have about 28 vessels. They're about 1,600 GPM per train. That's 14 trains. And it's going to cost somewhere around $32 million. So we plan to have these constructed at the wells in April of 2021, which is very fast. Thank you, OCWD. And also at the headquarters. That should be done in about July of 2021. And next slide, please.
Okay, Rosanne, I think you may already answered my next question for you, and that was going to be, will your agency rely on imported water into the future, or will you be developing treatment? So I think you already responded to those questions. Anything to add to that?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go back to Adan then. And the question I have for Adan is, there was a change by the Division of Drinking Water related to PFAS, and there was also additional noticing required through Assembly Bill 756. How has this impacted agencies and public trust?
Okay, I think that's a very good question. So AB 756 was signed by the governor last year by Assemblymember Cristina Garcia, who represents the Pico Rivera, Montebello area that is impacted by PFAS. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a trigger system for setting regulations, and she had been going to the Division of Drinking Water for years asking when they were going to get started. So she said, well, in frustration, since they're not starting on an MCL to do the toxicology studies to determine a standard, I just want you to notify the public if you have PFAS above the response level. And I just don't want you to notify them once a year through your consumer confidence report. You need to do it in real time. So that's what has really changed here, and what has really triggered in some communities a crisis of public trust in the water supply. And just think about it. There's 29 other response levels in California for different chemicals, and on those it's okay just to report them once a year on in the consumer confidence report. Technically, suppliers that have PFAS in their wells can choose to take a water supply source out of service. But what AB 756 has done, because of public perception, it essentially now forces communities like Yorba Linda and Fullerton to take these wells out of service if they can. Because, for example, in Assemblymember Garcia's own district in Pico Rivera and in Montebello, they do not have the choice to turn on the imported water. They don't even have a connection to the Metropolitan Water District. So in those communities, they're having to tell people not only that the water exceeds the response level because of this statistical risk calculation that was done, they also have to tell them that they're continuing to serve that water until at some point they can afford the treatment. I think Rosanne pointed to an illustration of all of the space that the treatment systems take, that the ion exchange systems. In the city of Pico Rivera and in the Pico Water District in particular, it's a very dense community. And to install that treatment plant, they're going to have to take down a bunch of houses because it's heavily residential. So that's another layer of public confidence that we have to deal with now that it's going to cause disruptions in the neighborhood. It's going to move people out, and they're also going to have the troubles with the construction trucks coming in and out as they're building these plants. And that's what happens. There's another critical issue that has to do with public confidence, and that's more on the money side, because you would, as Rosanne indicated, you would want to go after the responsible parties to recover your cost of treatment. But what happens is that the moment you notify the public, that triggers the statute of limitations for filing lawsuits against DuPont and other producers of PFAS. And so since we don't have a formal trigger system that sets in motion the maximum contaminant level standards, we don't know if we're going to be there in 5 years. And so it could be that the residents of Fullerton and Yorba Linda and all these other communities that have to spend $1 billion in total in Orange County for this treatment may get stuck with the bill. And for those of you that come from other parts of California, I think Rosanne was her comment that the state water board is about to issue additional testing orders. That makes it so that all of us are in the hook, perhaps, because of this. And then US EPA, for example, has expanded the list of PFAS that they want systems to monitor for. There's now 21. So we're playing Russian roulette here in California as this thing evolves without having a toxicology study to determine what the real risk threshold is. So there are legislators that are trying to do something about this. Senator Portantino from the La Cañada area introduced SB 996. It's a bill that's sponsored by the Metropolitan Water District and the California Municipal Utilities Association that represents a lot of the cities, I'm sure, that are represented on this webinar. And what they're trying to do is at least get a science panel to advise the state water board on setting and prioritizing these response levels to kind of send a signal to the legislature that somebody's doing something about it. I don't believe that goes far enough because it doesn't take the extra step of triggering the MCL process, which is what we really need. If we're going to be able to prevail in the courts, for example, you have to prove the potential or the actual damage of these chemicals, and you can't do that without doing the toxicological studies that are required.
Okay, thank you, Adan. So Rosanne, next for you, and we're talking about public trust. And I understand you also dealt with issues of public trust. And can you share with us about that?
Certainly. So I'll just say this, following what Adan says, once you lose public trust, it's really hard to get it back. And so it's very important to be out in front of this with communication and to be very transparent about what's going on and what's in the water and how we're addressing it. And we've been reporting this in our consumer confidence report for, as I said, this is going on our 4th year that we have PFAS. And we've always been in compliance. We've never been out of compliance. Like I said, we took the wells out of service February 6th, as soon as the response levels were lowered. So always been in compliance with that. But initially, when I guess some of these websites were trying to, it seems, putting out a lot of scary information, some misinformation, we actually had a few calls to the district with people very concerned, some of our customers. And one of them was actually a threat against our water quality engineer for serving water that has PFAS. And he was extremely upset about it. And so we thought, yes, let's do more social media. Let's get out and talk to the public. Let's go to the cities and talk about PFAS. And as a matter of fact, our former general manager is pictured there on the right. He's worked with the OC Register, and he's been interviewed multiple times by them talking about PFAS, that it's in our water and what we're doing about it. We also have tours of all of our facilities. We talk about PFAS. We had tours of our pilot studies. And we have open houses where we share all this information. So I think that we've come a long way with public communication on PFAS. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, staying on the topic of public trust, when public trust is so important, what can we do to help change the approach so science leads the regulatory process and not the other way around? Adan, that's for you.
Well, thank you. Well, let's understand, we've been talking about parts per million and parts per trillion and risk. And part of it is, as Rosanne has alluded, risk communications and having the public understand what's at risk. We have an opportunity with COVID-19 to reframe the way we talk to the public about risk. But let's just look at this chart a little bit and see what it means. When you asked, Ahmad, what a part per trillion is. Well, a part per trillion is equivalent to about 3 seconds out of every 100,000 years. So it's a very low, or I should say it's a very high level of protection when you're going down to the molecular level to take something out that exists at that infinitesimal molecular level. If we were to go down to parts per quadrillion, and there's some suggestions in some quarters that we ought to, you're talking about a chance that would occur equivalent to about 2.5 minutes out of the age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years. So what science has allowed us to do is also something that is challenging us in the way that we talk to the public, because if it exists in the molecular level, we have to admit that it exists. So to the next slide, please. So what can we do, and what has COVID-19 allowed us to start thinking about? Well, I think COVID-19 allows water suppliers, and then if you're dealing with air quality, the same applies to you, is to begin doing some thought experiments about how we talk about risk. So for example, on COVID-19, there's some that are arguing that we need to really target and protect the most vulnerable. And who are the most vulnerable? The most vulnerable are people over 60, who comprise only about 20% of the population. I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. Yeah, it's 20% of the population, and only 12.5% of the workforce is over 60. So if we devoted all the resources that we have been devoting to our isolation and everything that we've been doing to reduce risk to the people that are most at risk, we might be able to save an incredible amount of resources. The other thing that has happened with COVID-19 is that people are beginning to take responsibility for the level of risk that they're willing to expose themselves to. So for example, they're now opening restaurants and places where you could be near people. It's up to you to determine now how much of a risk you want to take. And people have been doing it with drinking water for a long time. So for example, the public, there's portions of the population, those people that earn more than $100,000 a year, as well as immigrants that earn very little money, have a disproportionate dependence on bottled water because they don't trust the tap water, perhaps because of some of the issues that we're talking about today. But I think we have an opportunity, as we do with COVID-19, to start talking about trade-offs. So for example, you may be saying, well, I'm going to avert a 1 chance in a million of catching cancer because the water has this level of PFAS, right? It hasn't even been proven yet, but you're going to fear that. So I'm going to drink bottled water. So you're trading that for the fact that you'll likely suffer from accelerated tooth decay because most brands of bottled water are not fluoridated. And there's been studies done by NRDC and other health groups that indicate that if you depend mostly on bottled water, you're going to have a higher rate of tooth decay. So we now have an ability because of COVID-19 to talk about the trade-offs. I think the other issue for why we need to take action is that all of our communities have areas that are disadvantaged, particularly the small communities. Here in Fullerton, for example, the wells that are impacted by PFAS are in the lowest economic area of the city, in our southernmost part. And so these communities now are facing enormous costs, as Rosanne indicated, double the cost for water, and they may lack the economies of scale to be able to afford the remedies that some of the wealthier communities are doing. And so what's happening, and I hope that all of you on this webinar will think about this with your elected officials as well as yourselves, is that when we deal with these issues, we're often dealing with activist groups that want to protect public health just the way all of us do. But what's been missing from the debate, especially from the disadvantaged communities, is that the people that are elected by the voters to represent them on these water boards or on city councils rarely have a say in this. So there's a group called the Community Water Systems Alliance that is dedicated to empowering elected officials and those of you that are appointed to represent these disadvantaged communities and to speak for yourselves. And just 2 weeks ago, for example, the State Water Board had a workshop on economic feasibility related to Chromium-6. I think I mentioned that for some communities, the household cost of mitigating for Chromium-6 every year is $5,000, which nobody could argue is economically feasible. So they had this workshop 2 weeks ago, and for the first time, about 40% of the testimony came from these officials that were representing these communities. And I think that allowed, for example, even the activist groups and what we call the NGOs, the non-government organizations, to see that they need to kind of help us grapple with this issue of risk communications and affordability, because there are trade-offs. So with that, I want to thank you for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Adan, Rosanne. That's my list of 7 questions we had pre-selected. I want to thank Rosanne and Adan for being the panelists, and we can all give them a virtual applause. Thank you. And I think Tran may have some questions on the chat room. So Tran, I'll turn back to you for those questions.
All right, thank you guys for the great presentation. I do have a couple of questions in regards to some of our attendees. So first off, first question, is if a water supplier confirms the presence of PFAS in drinking water, should the district send a notice in its monthly water bill similar to a Prop 65 warning to homes and businesses? I guess that.
Rosanne, you want to tackle that one?
Ladies first.
Sure, I'll handle that. So AB 756 has certain requirements, and those actually don't kick in until a water district samples quarterly for 4 quarters. And then if they find that the PFAS level exceeds the response level, then there are some requirements for response. Now, there's also notification requirements that a lot of water producers have already notified their customers if they're above the notification level. So there are 2 requirements for notification. One is above the notification level, and the other is above the response level. Now, how an agency does that is governed by AB 756, and there are requirements. It certainly says not only notify your customers, which that would be a logical way, would be to send maybe in the notice, assuming people use that, but you also have to go further. This is assuming you haven't removed the source of water. You have to go further, and you have to notify people who are not even your customers. So say at restaurants, if they come in, they use the ice machine, they use the water as part of their soda, or they just get water in a cup, you have to notify them as well. So I would envision that there would be postings around the agency, in everything, in retail shops, anywhere where water is served.
Thank you.
Adan, you wanna?
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, and if you look at what people are monitoring water agencies for example, if you have an email list of customers, you're well advised to notify them by email if you have their email addresses. I think the water suppliers are under extraordinary scrutiny on this question. And I think that a lot of the people I'm working with are advising to err on the side of safety, because you don't want to be accused of not doing everything you can to let people know. Now, the only difference here is that, for example, we do this anyway when there's pathogens in the water. For example, if there's a pathogen, it can make people sick. And it's what you hear about in the news every once in a while when a water supplier issues a boiled water notice. The difference between a boiled water notice and what we're having to do here, in the abundance of caution, is that a boiled water notice actually does something. It makes the water safe to use. Whereas with PFAS, we're telling the public, hey, we've exceeded the response level, but there's nothing you can do about it. And that's a major challenge, I think, for water suppliers that we're going to have to deal with for many years to come.
Great. And just kind of a quick follow-up to that, if there is any indication, and I think this is towards you, Rosanne, are you aware of a requirement to post signs, like say the Santa Ana River bed is found to have PFAS or something along those lines? Is there a requirement for that, for posting signs to let the public know?
So this is very interesting. Right now, there are no requirements. I would assume that once DDW issues monitoring orders to those wastewater treatment plant dischargers, that at that point, they will be required in the future to take some sort of action. And I would think that that would require a posting of signs. But that's still something that's being discussed at DDW. So expect to hear more about that later this year.
Right. Another question that had come up from the attendees, OCWD must be getting their source of water from OCSD that has PFAS in it. Are they removing it from the GWRS treatment before recharging the basin?
Well, I can answer that too. As a matter of fact, yes, there is PFAS. And yes, that water the PFAS is being removed. In fact, everything coming out to and out of GWRS, all of that's been purified before it goes into the groundwater. So there should be no concerns about PFAS. It's gone non-detect. And I'll just go a step further. The imported water has been tested, the Met imported water, and there's been no indication of PFAS there as well. So in effect, the GWRS water that's being put into the ground is actually diluting the PFAS.
Rosanne, for those of you from out of the area, could you explain what GWR stands for and OCSD?
Go ahead.
I was going to say DWR is the Department of Water Resources.
No, GWRS, groundwater recharge.
The groundwater replenishment system, which is a very elaborate treatment system that Orange County Water District has worked with its fellow member agencies to build, that basically purifies that water before it's introduced to the ground, where it's further purified by nature. And it's a major source of drinking water for those of us in Orange County today. And OCSD is the Orange County Sanitation Districts, which is responsible for treating all the sewage in our county.
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you. Next question, is there any talk about all water systems being required to sample for PFAS or PFAS?
Well,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, right now it's just the monitoring orders. If DDW issues a monitoring order, then that water agency is required to sample for that particular well. Now, I understand that there are other water agencies that have voluntarily checked their wells. I couldn't talk to that, but I know that that's happening. So at this point, we're waiting for that July 2020 further set of monitoring orders from DDW. And at that point, we'll see. And I think this will only expand. We'll see that this problem is pretty prevalent across the groundwater basins, not just the Orange County basin, but the other basins as well within California.
Well, I just wanted to add that there's 4,000 varieties of this stuff out there. And it's in everything. And in fact, it's in a lot of products that we use at home. For example, this stuff is so difficult to detect because it's everywhere that in order to be able to take a sample, there's very tough rules requiring, for example, you can't use any deodorant, you can't use shampoo, you can't use most types of soap. In bathing and in cleaning yourself, you can't wear a jacket that has a Teflon or anything of that sort, or Scotch Guard. So this is very prevalent. And as we go down this line, depending on the public reaction, because this is being driven by public opinion and legislative action at this point, we may find ourselves more and more finding that this is in its different forms everywhere. And then the only other thing I wanted to add on this is that when we think about PFAS, we also have to be thinking about what's happening abroad, because as Rosanne indicated, a lot of what is coming in today is through imported products. And the final point is that even the way that this occurs in sewage treatment plants, they're not really even sure. There have been some studies suggesting that there's what they call precursor agents that come in a non-PFAS form into the sewage treatment plant that through the way that we treat sewage combines itself into PFAS. And so again, the question about whether this is science is still ongoing. And we may find that this is more prevalent than we even think today.
Okay. Thank you. So, with APWA being an organization or association that is mixed with public agencies as well as consultants, what are the opportunities for our private community to help with, detecting PFAS or anything along those lines? I'll go straight to you, Rosanne, first, and then Adan after.
So, what's really interesting is the CDC has actually assigned some projects across the country to various organizations to look into this. And right here in our backyard, Dr. Scott Bartell at UCI Medical Center, he has been tasked with his team to look at, to actually go and sample blood out of people who live here who may have been drinking the water that has PFAS in it, and see what kind of effects, and see if they can tie the water to the PFAS in the blood. So we at Yorba Linda Water District are participating in this study with the Water Quality Panel and also the Community Advisor Panel, because we think it's good to know this information. We need to know how this is affecting people. One of the things we'd like also is to see if there's an area that doesn't have groundwater, and do they have the same problems just from maybe being exposed to all these PFAS products? So is it the groundwater, or what percentage of that would be your lotions, your makeup, your dental floss, the cookware, your clothing?
Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, and I would add to that that the Community Water Systems Alliance was created, again, to help those that have the most severe impacts, whether it be because of health or finance, from the regulatory process that California currently has in place. And, many of you work with city council members and elected officials that, may not think that they're expert in this area. In order to be able to talk and testify at hearings and so forth. I would encourage you to work closely with them. You can give me a call. I'm sure you can call Rosanne, and we'll give you information and resources that are more accessible to those that don't have the technical expertise that you have. And then I think we also need you. I think there will come times when we will be looking for your ranks to educate us as communicators primarily, so that we can set up and be articulate and truthful when we're in front of legislators and regulators that are making up the rules.
Right.
I think there's a lot of room to cross-pollinate between those of us that communicate and those of you that are the technical experts.
Right. I just want to add is where I was going with the study is that they're going to be looking for volunteers to actually participate in the CDC study. So if you're interested to know whether it's in your blood and how it may be impacting you, I recommend that you participate.
Great. Last question. I know we're a little bit over the scheduled time, so there's a question out there that folks have been asking, and it's kind of global. We're talking a lot about California requirements, right? I know we're in California, we have some special rules and laws and everything like that. The concern is that, or not the concern, the question is, well, is this just a California problem, or is other states affected by this, and can the feds overrule a California requirement? Adan, it looks like you want to answer this.
I was looking at Rosanne.
I can't see.
Well, okay, I can start. So there have been many lawsuits across the country, and these cities, states, civilians have sued 3M for pollution. You've seen the movies Dark Waters. There's been several films out about PFAS, and everybody's been successful in getting 3M, Chemours, DuPont to pay for treatment and actually reimburse people, because in the movie Dark Waters, the poor people were exposed to, I think it was a 3M plant, and at very high levels. So yeah, it's happening across the country. It's not just us.
Yes, and I think that there's some states that kind of took early steps. For example, Connecticut has some very elaborate steps, so much so that they're so expensive that the local utilities are complaining that they don't have the money to carry out what the state has ordered. And so there's some big issues in Connecticut. Michigan has also been a leader in sampling for PFAS and for regulating it and requiring its removal from water systems. And interestingly, for a lot of different parts of the country, they don't have the luxury of imported water, which we have in California. Many of them just depend either on the rivers or on groundwater. And so there's hard choices everywhere on this stuff.
Great. All right. Well, that wraps up our Q&A. Thank you very much, everyone that's joining us today. Thank you for our panelists, virtual applause. So just to let everyone know that is attending, we are recording this webinar. We will post this on our LinkedIn page. You can kind of see the LinkedIn link on the bottom. Please follow us so that you guys could know when we push out the recording. Also, it also allows you to look at upcoming webinars and programming through that platform. So that pretty much wraps up our webinar, and it's been a success as far as I can tell. We appreciate and thank the panelists as well as the moderator, and we hope to see all of you in June 25th at our next online webinar. So for now, have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.